Hi, it's Simon here from Analog Anorak. Today I'm going to be reviewing a record that was released a couple of years ago and didn't really get too much of a reaction, and I really think it's worth talking about it and looking at this release. It's a Mercury re-release. It's this one, Pictures at an Exhibition by Moussorgsky, and the conductor was Kubelik and the orchestra the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. It was the only mono release amongst some stereo classics. I was really interested to get hold of a copy, and it did help that this is not on an audiophile label, so it was very affordable. I think it was about £20. I was really interested to listen to a copy of this because when it was released in 1951, it became at that time one of the seminal demonstration discs at the beginning of high fidelity. So before I do the actual review, I think it's important to try to uncover what was so special about this mono recording. Now, this release was on the Mercury label and was one of the original releases that involved Wilma Cozart-Fine as the producer, and her husband-to-be Robert Fine was the engineer. Now, I won't be doing too much about Wilma Cozart and Raphael Kubelik on this occasion, because I think the aspects that are really interesting about this recording are more due to the approach and equipment used by Robert Fine during this really important recording session. The session in question took place on the 23rd and 24th of April 1951 at Orchestral Hall in Chicago. At that particular point in time, Mercury recordings in the US were still at an early state, and they hadn't got access on this particular occasion yet to a portable tape recorder. So there was really quite a unique arrangement for this occasion of obtaining a dedicated high quality telephone line to a nearby studio in a different part of Chicago. Quite a staggering concept really, when from an audio perspective people are worrying about how short they can make their interconnects. Now, there are some people who claim to hear a few crackles and hums during this recording. I had a good listen on the two copies that I've got. I've got to admit I didn't hear them. This was the first session with Mercury recording the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and Kubelik. And there had been previous recording sessions carried out by Columbia and RCA in Orchestral Hall. And the general feedback was that they were pretty disappointed with the results. And this led unfairly to the impression that it was a difficult venue to record in. Bob Fine, however, wondered how you could fail to do a good recording in this venue. He did, however, take an unusual, relatively primitive and purist approach to recording on this occasion. And this approach was very influential with the future Mercury mono recordings. At this time, most studios' mono recordings utilise several microphones and using a mixer to try to get the balance right, particularly the quieter instruments. Now, Bob Fine's approach was going back to the days of the 78s of using a single dedicated microphone located in the sweet spot, the point in the venue where the combination of sound and resonance from the venue were at their best. He had a kind of instinctive feel to where this might be because he'd been using a particular microphone, the Neumann U47, for a few months and had been getting very good results. The U47 had been around for a few years, and its strengths were very high sensitivity to sound and also a really good wide frequency range. It had two settings, directional and omnidirectional. Now, for Bob Fine's approach on this particular occasion, it was using the omnidirectional setting. For this particular performance, he identified the sweet spot approximately 15 foot right above Raphael Kubelik. On the first day of the recording session, they got the orchestra to play some of the loudest parts of Pictures from an Exhibition to get the levels correct. They did record several parts of the rehearsals that day and later reviewed the results at the recording studio and made a few further tweaks. So it was the second day where the actual takes that were used on the records happened. Another important part of this recording is that, in contrast to some producers, for instance Decca, where a producer would try to work alongside the conductor to get a good recording, this recording was pretty much left entirely in Kubelik's hands, with him being told to just conduct as if in a normal concert, because he would have complete control over the sound rather than adjusting levels during the performance. Following the session taking place, it was clear that something special had happened, and later that year, when the albums were released, there was a really positive critical response, which led to this record being a top seller. The critic from the New York Times, Howard Taubman, summed up his experience by saying, "One feels oneself in the living presence of the orchestra." And this term, living presence, was coined as a brand and really led to a clear identity for Mercury Records going into the future alongside living stereo. I think we can, as audiophiles, relate to this term living presence, because that's really what we're aiming for with our own equipment, to go beyond just really lovely, pleasant sounding music towards that sense of something magical happening in front of us in our living rooms or listening rooms. This record was really important to the Fines and Mercury Records because, in essence, they were mining for sound, and they really hit the mother lode. They struck gold on this occasion, and it led to them having a blueprint for how to get high quality sound in the future. The recent re-release of this album on vinyl has come from Tom Fine, Wilma and Bob's son. Tom Fine has mainly protected the legacy of Mercury recordings through the digital pathway. He did, about 10 years ago, however, work with Analog Productions on a few Mercury releases using an all-analog route, but on this occasion he has utilised high-quality digital files which were sent to Abbey Road using their system of vinyl from digital sources with half-speed mastering. Now, this has been used recently with some of the Beatles re-releases. I got hold of a copy of this record because I was fascinated to find out whether there was still any power behind this excitement that the record generated initially, or whether future developments have totally superseded the impact of this recording. This re-release is designed to be played on modern equipment using a stereo cartridge, and I took the opportunity to listen on my more modern deck, a modified Technics, as well as my more legacy deck with the idler drive. I used the advice included on the album of setting the volumes very high from the beginning, and did find that this really was the most appropriate approach when listening to a recording taken from a single microphone. I did feel that the most impressive results were from the more modern turntable. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to this recording, as it does have some really major strengths. It's a very impressive, engrossing listen, and the performance from Kubelik is really strong. He was still a relatively young conductor and a bit inconsistent, but this was one of his really strong early triumphs. As far as the sonic qualities, there are some real highlights. It's quite amazing knowing that this came from a single microphone, that you can occasionally hear the clicking of the woodwind keys, and it does send tingles up the spine when you hear the opening trumpet entry by Bud Herseth ringing clear as a bell in this venue. I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that there isn't really a tubey element to the sound here. I also think that the final section, the Gate of Kiev, the build-up is very impressive, and the recording of all the percussion is very, very clear, but probably because of the microphone having its strengths really in the upper and mid-band region, the ending where on some recordings there's that really impressive organ rumble coming through, that isn't really there. I mean, the organ you can just about make out in the general volume of the ending, but I would say that's the only element which does highlight some of the limitations of this purist approach to recording. I don't think, from an audiophile perspective, this is the greatest recording of pictures at an exhibition, but it's probably one of the most important, and it is really strong from a performance perspective. I think some of its strengths are that its sheer uniqueness of this brief period where they reintroduced a single but much higher quality microphone to recording classical music pieces. It's just a fascinating early example and the birth of a legacy. I think, however, if you do compare this recording with the other recent resurrected demonstration record from the 1950s, which is Duke Ellington's masterpieces from Analog Productions, that still wipes the floor with compared with this recording. I would have ideally loved to have got a copy of the 1951 USA release of this recording. Although they were a real hit at the time and lots of copies were produced, not many have survived well to this period, and at this particular point in time I'm only too aware of how expensive it is to import used or new vinyl from the USA to the UK. I did manage to get this copy, which is from 1954, and it is the only dedicated UK release of this particular record. You can notice it's small, it's a 10-inch recording, and this was done by HMV mastering engineers, and I suspect, unlike the US recordings, this was not done from master tapes. The original US Mercury release of a piece that was just under 30 minutes long on a 12-inch LP did open up the opportunities for getting a really high quality recording. In contrast, I think this recording was done on a 10-inch for sheer economical reasons, really, that money was extremely tight in the UK at the time, and I don't think this record would have sold on a 12-inch. I did wonder about whether it was worth buying this record. I'm glad I did, because it's actually not bad. I had to play it on with a dedicated mono cartridge from the 1950s to get the best results. One of my General Electric variable reluctance cartridges. I mean, it absolutely excels as far as the tubey sound, and the music is surprisingly dynamic in many places, and I was really surprised on a record of this size to again be hearing some of the resonance from the venue. But if you put this heads up with the recent re-release, it doesn't stand a chance. But I'm glad I got hold of it, because the HMV engineers, they really did a pretty good job within the limitations that were set for them. Although this release does pale from a pure audiophile perspective with Duke Ellington's masterpiece, it has a lot going for it, and it is a really unique listen. Before I finish, I've recently been reading a fascinating book by Howard Massey about the English recording studios, and there were some really Anunnaki details about the U47. There is some really nice symmetry in relation to the U47. There's a copy of, this is from the Mercury box set, a very short interview with Wilma Cozart. Now the U47, as I said, it did get superseded with these with these more advanced microphones that look a little bit like egg whisks, really. And it was used by Bob Fine in this purist omnidirectional setting. But over the next 10 years, the U47 really had a starring role at Abbey Road, because a certain George Martin really liked these microphones and used them a lot. And this microphone was described as one of the workhorses of Abbey Road. So it's lovely to think that the circle was completed, carrying out the re-release mastering at Abbey Road. And another feature about the U47 in the 1960s, again in London, is a legendary producer, Joe Meek. He was a huge fan of the U47 and utilised this in his studio work, which, because of his major personality difficulties and eventually, sadly, his mental illness, he ended up doing one of the first home studios, and he utilised the U47. He spoke about, when recording vocals, about this strong sense of presence that came with this microphone. And as a little bit of a bonus for those who've made it this far, I have included on the playlist section a few of Joe Meek's recordings, and there's even one set up in a recording studio where you can see a U47 being used, but not in the way Joe Meek did, because of this. He needed to cope with this overly sensitive microphone, so he would cover it with so much foam that it'd be about the size of a football. So obviously they didn't include that in the video. But if you're interested, have a listen, because there's some great songs, including, of course, the legendary Telstar, which was, I think, the first British #1 in the States. A quite visionary producer, and a tragic, absolutely tragic tale. I'm going to be doing some more on Kubelik, including a mono versus stereo shootout soon, so I hope to get that released soon. I'm really chuffed that we've had such a good reaction to the original sounds video, and which has brought a lot more people into subscribing, and that's great. And if there is anybody who has had experience of listening to an original mono recording of the Kubelik, I'd be really fascinated to hear whether it's any good, really. But certainly this re-release is an absolute asset, a chance to hear a real piece of recorded history. That's me signing off, and I'll try and get another video out pretty soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.